Hey everybody, in today's video, it's time. I can finally talk to you about not the 200 to 600, the 180 to 600. In this video, we're going to be looking at the lens, its design, how it works. We're also going to be comparing this lens directly to pretty much every Nikon Z zoom lens I could get my hands on, and some f-mount zoom lenses as well. We'll also take a look at its image quality, we'll also take a look at its focus speed, and there's lots of different things that we're going to talk about in today's video. I know it's been a long time waiting for this lens, but it's finally here. Let's talk about it. First and foremost, obviously, the 200 to 600 has been one of the lenses that's been on the Nikon Z roadmap for the longest time. Nikon decided over the past few years of the development of this lens that they didn't just want to make a 200 to 600, they decided to make this a 180 to 600, adding a little bit of extra focal length on the wide angle view. It is a variable aperture lens. A lot of people were undecided whether it would be a constant aperture or a variable aperture lens, but this lens is variable aperture. It is a 5.6 to 6.3. It does have built-in VR, built-in image stabilization, so it relies on a mixture of in-lens optical VR and in-body stabilization. They will then combine to give you a total of 5.5 stops of image stabilization. For this lens, I've been impressed when I have been using it with slow shutter speeds that you can still keep it quite steady. Now, officially the lens is a non-S lens, and in Nikon's range of lenses, they have non-S lenses and also S lenses. The S lenses will effectively be the higher quality, different coatings, faster style of lenses, but then they generally tend to be more expensive. Generally is also going to have a more accessible price point, but that does mean that it doesn't have some of the coatings. It does mean that it doesn't have any of the S branding on the lens either. We'll take a look at image quality later on in this video to figure out, does that really make a massive difference to the image quality? What is the quality of this lens like compared to some of the other lenses that are S lenses, like the 100 to 400, the 400 4.5, and the 800 PF, the 600 f4, and so on. I've compared it against a number of different lenses. So let's start talking about the build and the design of this lens. It fits in with the design culture of other Z mount lenses. We have different textured control rings and commands, customizable buttons, dials, and so on, as you would expect. We have a lens control ring at the back that is customizable, aperture, ISO, exposure compensation. You then have your main zoom ring in the middle of your lens. It's also worth mentioning that this zoom ring, the throw of the zoom ring is very short. So to zoom the lens from 180 to 600 is only 70 degrees. So that only takes a turn of 70 degrees. So super easy to turn and very quick to move through the entire focal length range. In stark comparison to the 200 to 500, that took a massive turn to get it all the way through the zoom range. So the 180 to 600 means that you can really zoom all the way into that 600 very quickly if you needed to. Also, when you do zoom this lens in and out, it is an internal zooming lens. Nothing extends from the front of the lens, which is always great to see. So it is one single unit. It does not get any longer than it is here. Whether it's at 180 or at 600, it is all internal. We then have a range of lens function buttons around the front of the lens. I was a bit concerned that if Nikon tried to make this lens to a price, then they might not add in the lens function buttons, but actually I'm glad to see that they're here. These are obviously customizable buttons. You can add a number of different functions to them, such as autofocus settings, changing between different autofocus positions. There's lots of things you can add to these buttons. Towards the front of the lens, there is a rubber end gasket on the front of the lens as well. So if you do put the lens down front element first, there is a nice rubber front cap that will kind of stop you from damaging the front of the lens itself. And also the lens will come with a lens hood. It is actually a pretty sturdy lens hood. It's not overly big, and it has a nice click push to release and push to lock in button on the side of the lens hood. Obviously this lens hood is also reversible on this lens as well. So the lens hood itself is what I would expect from a lens of this quality and a lens of this price point. It's an acceptable lens hood. It does its job. It's bigger than the lens. Nice click-in system when you want to reverse it and also when you want to place it on the lens itself. Moving towards the back of the lens, we also then have a removable tripod collar. When it comes to Nikon's tripod collars, there's a couple of different variants that we have with things like the 100 to 400 and the 400 4.5. They have a little foot that is removable. When you look at the 800, the 400 and the 600, the Pro Series lenses, they have a fixed foot, but you could unscrew it if you wanted to, but it's not like a quick release foot. Whereas this tripod collar is fully removable. It splits into this two-part design here. I would probably go as far as to say that even with the weight of this lens, I'm quite happy to shoot this lens without this tripod collar. Obviously, if you're planning on fixing it to a tripod in a hide, for example, then yes, you would need the collar. But handheld, without that collar, it's actually really nice to use. And the weight of this lens is quite a nice weight without the collar as well. So definitely something to think about, definitely something to consider if you are buying this lens, whether you want to use it with or without the collar. I quite like using it without the collar. Obviously, if you want to attach that, it is just a screw and clamp system. So when you put it on the lens, you clamp the collar back down and then screw that collar tight to clamp it to the lens itself. There is a little indent in the body of the lens where the collar will sit into, so you can't accidentally pull it off if it's not tight enough, but obviously if you loosen it enough, it will come off. Nikon have also incorporated the strap attachment points on this collar as well, so just be aware of that. If you remove the collar, you also remove any point of being able to attach a strap to it, so just be aware of that. You obviously had two tripod mounts on the bottom of the tripod collar as well. Also is obviously a weather sealed lens as well. In scenarios where you want to use this in wet conditions, in rainy conditions, you'll still be able to continue shooting with this. Now in terms of switches on the side of the lens, we have two switches. We have an autofocus and manual focus switch, and then we also have a focus distance switch. You can either set this lens to focus for its full focal length range, or you can set the lens to focus between infinity and 6 meters. So if the subject that you are photographing is only going to be 6 meters or further away, you can limit the focus of this lens. You can use this 180 to 600 with teleconverters. Both the Z mount 1.4 and 2 times teleconverter will work in the back of this lens. Something to consider if you do need even more focal length than the 600 millimeters, but just be aware that obviously you are already at a 600 f 6.3, so as soon as you start adding those teleconverters in, your aperture is going to increase quite rapidly, so just be aware of that. For those of you interested in its closest focusing distance, at the wide end you'll have a closest focusing distance of 1.3 meters, and then when you get all the way up to 600 millimeters you have a closest focusing distance of 2.4 meters. So 1.3 meters at the wide, 2.4 meters when zoomed in to 600 millimeters. So overall, when it comes to the design of this lens, I really like the design of it. The way that it looks is nice. The style of the lens is great. Obviously, it's not overly bright. It doesn't reflect light. It's a nice kind of black coated lens. I really enjoy the look of it. The only thing I probably don't like about the design of the lens is this tripod collar. I just don't like the way that this hinge kind of extends around the edge of the barrel. I just would have loved a way if they could have had that hinge flush rather than having this lump on the top of the lens, but it is what it is. You can't change that now. I just wish that this tripod collar looked slightly differently. It is also worth mentioning as well that with this tripod collar, the foot itself is not removable. You have to remove the entire collar. So if you do want to swap the foot out for an Arca Swiss foot, then you are going to have to replace the entire collar to do that, or you put an Arca Swiss plate on the base of the collar and then use that to attach to a tripod as well, which is what I've personally been doing, but I do know a lot of you like to replace the foot with Arca Swiss feet, so if you want to do that, you have to replace the whole collar. Now, when it comes to the weight of this lens, the first time I picked it up, I did feel like it was actually heavier than I was expecting it to be. When I first took it out of the box, I was like, oh, I was expecting it to be a bit lighter than this, but as I've been using it more and more, and when I've been picking it up with other lenses, I have noticed that actually this is a little bit lighter than I thought. When I've been using this next to some of the other bigger lenses that I have, they're obviously heavier. It doesn't feel as heavy as I first thought it did. I'll put the weights up here somewhere on the screen. As to what the weight of the lens is with the collar and without the collar, because obviously, as I mentioned earlier, it is a removable collar, and I quite like the idea of shooting it without the collar, but I do think that Nikon have put in a little bit of extra effort just to make this as small and as light as it could be, considering it does have a massive range of being all the way from 180 all the way up to 600. Even with that weight, this lens is still really nicely balanced. The general gist of where the weight lies in the lens, I feel like it's almost towards the middle, the back side of this lens. Doesn't really feel like it's front heavy at all. I do feel like it's very evenly distributed through the lens. There's not really a section of the lens that feels heavier or lighter than the other. So I'm really happy with how it balances, even with whether you're using a small or a light body on the back of it. So whether that's a Z6, Z7, Z8, Z9, for example, I've been pretty happy with how it balances. It feels quite nice to hold and quite nice to handle. I've obviously got some size comparisons of this lens against the vast majority of lenses that I feel like people would want to see this next to. So we can take a look at this lens compared to things like the 100 to 400, the 400mm f4.5, the f mount 200 to 500, the f-mount 500mm PF. It's clearly the Z-mount equivalent to the widely popular Nikon 200 to 500, but with the differences being the extra focal length, so the extra range of being able to go from 180 all the way to 600, obviously. And then I suppose the only downside is that it's not a constant aperture. 5.6 to a 6.3. It is what it is. I'm sure to some of you that will be disappointing. I'm sure to others it will be perfectly fine. You do have to keep in mind that the difference between 5.6 and 6.3 is very minimal. It's not like it's a 5.6 to f8 or a 5.6 to 7.1 or something like that. Now, when it comes to the transition of that aperture and where it transitions from each aperture range, generally you will be shooting at f5.6 all the way up to 300mm, and then beyond 300mm it will start to go towards 6.3, so you get to f6 and then f6.3. I'll also put a full list of what aperture and what focal length next to me here to give you an idea of where the lens will move from 5.6 to f6 to 6.3. Okay, so obviously I have put this lens through a number of different tests when it comes to image quality, focus speed, and we've got lots of sample images to look at, and also focus breathing as well. So what we're going to do is we'll look at some sample images first that I've taken with this lens over the past couple of days, and then we'll look at some of the examples that I've got to show you of focus speed and image quality compared to the vast majority of the lenses. We are going to compare image quality against the 500 PF, the 200 to 500, the 100 to 400, the 400 4.5, the 600mm f4, the 400mm 2.8, the 800mm PF, also with and without teleconverters. I've pretty much done everything. So if I've missed a lens, I'm sorry, but I tried my best. I've hopefully covered every lens and every combination you could think of. So we're going to take a look at that in terms of image quality as well. Also just wanted to try something different and give you a bit of a voiceover and talk through some of the sample images that I've shot. In previous videos with sample images, I would just play the images back and hope that you would understand what I'm trying to convey in sample images. But I thought for this video, I'll just talk you through some of them. The use case scenario and the situation I've been able to use the 180 to 600 in, it was mixed lighting. The start of the day was heavy fog, and then turned into a very harsh day with no cloud cover in the sky. So quite a mix of different lighting situations and setups, but hopefully some of the sample images will try and show you the characteristics of this lens, and you can get some really good sharp detail out of this lens in the right circumstance. So this first shot here is a wonderfully backlit gannet, wings wide open. I've got the light kind of shining through the wings. This is early in the morning. I've got lots and lots of fog and mist in this shot, so hence why it's kind of has this glow to the image. That isn't through editing. This is all just natural light shining through that fog to kind of give me that misty effect. These two in-flight shots are, again, still in that morning period where there's lots of mist in the air, and you can see that affecting the sharpness. The biggest takeaway is the lens is still perfectly able to focus and follow and track the subjects in flight, but they're not showing the true sharpness in these images because of that mist. And obviously at 600mm that's being compressed in the air as well. This is just a bit of a landscape shot here. I glanced over to my right hand side, saw the mist rolling between these concrete bollards, and I thought that's actually quite a nice shot, good compression. Using a long focal length lens here as a landscape shot still works, and we get that really nice mist rolling up towards the top of the frame with the out of focus foreground. Now this is a shot that I really like. We've got a gannet coming in here to land, wings wide open, and we've got a slight bit of movement in the tips of the wings because of the movement and the motion in the wings. And what also is a great thing to look at is how sharp the subject is. So this is the wider shot, and then cropping that in to the crop shot, and I probably say I prefer the composition of the wider shot, but cropping in here just to show you the detail and the sharpness that you're able to capture. It does emphasize the movement in the wings, but the detail in the heads of the birds is really nice. And as I've realized with my time as a wildlife photographer, the position of the wings of a bird can make or break a shot, so it's always important to try and capture or figure out which image you prefer with where your wings of your subject are. So here we have a really nice effectively backlit shot, but we're also showing off depth of field and the sparkle and reflection off the water in the background. I really like trying to do this if you have sunlight reflecting off the water surface, and especially if you're shooting birds in flight, you can really try and use that as an amazing background behind just a traditional blue sky or traditional flat sky. The camera and lens had no issues in terms of follow focus and keeping track of this subject, as even with a distracting background of the water reflecting and so on. So worked really nicely and creates quite a nice shot. This is a more intense example. This is towards the middle of the reflection of the water, so you can see that it's much brighter, but the camera's still locked on the subject, still nice and sharp, dealing with effectively a heavy backlit subject here, and also showing just the depth of field effect of the lens as well. This is more of your traditional bird in flight shot, and effectively showing you just the lens performance of the sharpness, feathers, detail, and also the depth of field on the background. Another traditional bird in flight shot here. Again, level of sharpness and detail is what you would expect from a lens like this. Really nice static shot here. It's really nice and sharp, and there's not too much going on in the background, but we have a slight bit of blur in the foreground with some grass on that left-hand side, and just using that negative space over on the right-hand side of the image. This is a really good example of what you can do with a smaller subject and also being able to control your depth of field in the foreground and the background. I did find that the 100 to 600 actually has quite clean. It doesn't produce a busy effect. I actually quite like it, even though that we've got lots of reeds and grass in the background, which can often be quite busy. We have a very small subject here. We're quite close to this subject, but it's a good example of sharpness. So this is the wide angle shot, and then we can then go into the close-in detailed shot, and we can see the level of detail and sharpness that we still get in the smaller fine feathers. So that is a crop of the original shot, and even though we're cropping in, we can still get that really good fine detail on the feathers of the bird, which is great. This is a shot I really like, and composition I also really like as well. We have this kind of extreme rule of thirds. The subject is really over on that right-hand side, and obviously being a puffin, it's always a really good bird to photograph. Nice little puffin here perched on the cliff. Not the cleanest of shot. You can see that I've got dappled light. I've also got a foreground subject on the left-hand side that's kind of causing me a bit of out of focus area. So it's a difficult shot to try and get, but I think it works quite nicely. You don't always need to see the whole subject when it comes to capturing the subject in the frame. You can still tell that this is a full puffin. Okay, so we're going to take a look at some image comparisons between the 180 to 600 and a mixture of other lenses. Each one of these comparisons is going to be zoomed in to 200%, so you're looking at these at 200%. Obviously, you're not going to be looking at all of your images at 200%, but for the use case in this situation and comparing image quality of these lenses, every example is 200%. Okay, so up first for the image comparisons, we have the 180 to 600 on the left, and we also then have the 200 to 500 on the right. As you would expect, the 200 to 500 is starting to show its age. It's the older lens, it's been around for a long time, and it's also a cheaper price point. It's not as good as the 180 to 600. That's kind of a given. It is interesting that the 200 to 500, as you would expect, does sharpen up when it gets to 6.3, but it's still not significant enough of a jump to effectively match the 180 to 600 in terms of sharpness, at least. So next up we have the 100 to 400, and I've not adjusted for focal length here. I just also wanted to show you how much further away you are with the 400 than you are with the 600 at the same time. But we will take a look at the 100 to 400 with its teleconverter shortly. So 100 to 400 with its teleconverter, obviously giving us 560 millimeters at f8. I would probably say, based on the information in front of me, that the 180 to 600 is the sharper lens than the 100 to 400 with its 1.4 times teleconverter. Obviously, this is just one example and one use case, and we're taking a picture of a color checker rather than a natural subject, but it goes hopefully some way to give you an idea of what you might expect as a difference between the two. Next, we have the 400mm 4.5. Now, this is a lens that I've been using a lot over the past maybe 6 to 8 months, and I really have enjoyed using this lens. It's generally the smallest and the lightest of the lot of the lenses, but the quality is fantastic, and we can see this quality kind of shines through here. I do think the 400 4.5 is better than the 100 to 400, and we can see that quality difference when you compare that to the 180 to 600 as well. We will take a look at the 400 with its 1.4 teleconverter. So the 400 4.5 with the 1.4 times teleconverter, and I think image quality wise they're very close. You have the advantage of the 400 4.5 being a 400 4.5 without the tele. When you add the teleconverter, it seems to be that they are very close to each other in terms of image quality. I would probably give it to the 400 4.5 with the teleconverter just being a little bit sharper and also slightly more contrasty than the 180 to 600 is. But they give you a very similar focal length and similar aperture, both close to 600. The 180 to 600 obviously being at 600, and the 400 4.5 with a 1.4 tele would be at 560, but both are at f6.3. We then bring in one of the legendary status lenses, the 500mm f5.6 PF, and the image quality of that lens shines through. So yes, the 500mm f5.6, which yes is an f-mount lens, is better in terms of sharpness and image quality than the 180 to 600. I would expect that. It's a prime lens. It's obviously had legendary status for the past few years now, and it's maybe 50% more expensive, maybe depending on the region that you're in, maybe double the cost. So when looking at price, I would expect this difference in performance, similar to the 400 4.5. Next up, we have the Z 400mm f2.8 with its built-in TC, but we do not have the teleconverter applied at this point, and you can see straight away why the 400mm 2.8 is a significantly more expensive lens. Even though that it's not got the same focal length, we can clearly see that the image on the right is the sharper image. When we then apply the 400mm teleconverter, again we get much closer now. We're at 560 millimeters at f4, so it's letting in a lot more light, and we are sharper, more detailed than the 180 to 600. That would be expected because of the sheer price difference in these lenses. And obviously we're not really seeing the advantage of f4 in a low light situation here. So next up we have the 600mm f4. Obviously it has a built-in teleconverter. This is just shot at 600 millimeters here, and we can see why the lens is more expensive. It is clearly just the sharper, more controlled, more detailed lens, right? To be expected. And then we have the 800. So this is the 800mm PF. We are now more zoomed in because the focal lengths are still at 600 on the left, 800 on the right. So it gives you a good example of the difference between 600 and 800. And obviously the 800 PF is the better quality lens. Now we can see the difference between the 180 to 600 on its own and then the 180 to 600 with the 1.4 times teleconverter. Keep in mind that this takes this up to f9. So you aren't going to get a lot of light, but if you do need that extra reach, I think the image quality loss isn't that bad. Considering you're going up all the way up to 840 millimeters, you can still get quite a good chunk of detail and sharpness. We do then have the 180 to 600 with its 1.4 teleconverter against the 800 PF. Clearly, as you would expect, the 800 prime is the better lens. 180 to 600 against the 600mm f4 with its built-in 1.4 times teleconverter being the better lens again, as you would expect. A lot of that has gone the way that we would have expected. To summarize what we've just looked at there, the 180 to 600 gives you the maximum amount of flexibility, obviously being able to zoom all the way from 180 to 600 with a slight adjustment to image quality. You can sharpen it up in post if you want to, but it obviously has a slight effect on image quality because of the range that it has. So therefore, the prime lenses are going to be sharper and more detailed lenses, but they might not be able to get you close enough to the subject that you're trying to photograph. I would go as far as to say that I would choose a 180 to 600 over a 100 to 400, purely because of the extra reach and the image quality doesn't appear to be that massively different. The 500 PF, similar to that 400 4.5, it's all about the flexibility, whether you want to be fixed at a focal length or whether you want zoom. And when it comes to the bigger lenses, the 800 PF, the 400 2.8 and the 600 f4, that's to be expected. They're in a completely different price bracket, so they're going to be better lenses. I really think the key differences here are it's definitely better than the 200 to 500. I would go as far as to say that it's definitely better than the 100 to 400 with or without its teleconverter. And then it's a question of that 400 4.5 and the 500 PF, whether you want them to be used as prime lenses with the 1.4 teleconverters, or you want the flexibility of being able to zoom in and out with the 180 to 600. Hopefully you're still with me. That was a lot to go through, but I wanted to be very thorough with this lens because I know that a lot of you have been waiting for this lens for a long time. Hopefully you found that useful. To summarize, I do think that for a lot of people, this is going to be the go-to lens for wildlife, sport, anything where they really need that extra focal length to get towards 600, this lens is going to make sense. Whether you're a Z9 user, Z8 user, whether you're a Z6, Z7, whatever it is, this is an incredible lens that's going to be a great addition to the Z mount range of lenses. Is it perfect? No. It's obviously made to be as small and as light as possible. It's obviously made to a price point. Generally, obviously, one of the lower price point lenses in this focal length category. So in some circumstances, something like the 400mm 4.5 might be the right choice. In some circumstances, the 100 to 400 might be the right choice. And in other situations, the 800 PF or the 400 2.8 or the 600 f4 might be the right choice, but they're in a completely different price bracket. I think in terms of value, flexibility of focal length, this is a no-brainer. It makes sense to the vast majority of people. Obviously, if you wanted something that is the smallest and lightest, I would still probably point someone towards the 400mm 4.5. But if you wanted the most amount of flexibility and the most amount of focal length in one lens, it's the 180 to 600. So far, I've been really impressed with this lens, and I think it's going to do the exact job what it needs to do. And for the vast majority of you that have been waiting for this lens, I think you'll be very happy with it as well. And I think you'll be glad that you waited for it, because I do honestly think that this is the best lens in its category. Mixture of focal length, size, weight, focus speed, weather sealing, build quality, I am pretty sure that this would be very hard to beat. Also, if you've stayed with me for this long, then I also just wanted to talk about how we sailed through 45,000 subscribers, and I can't believe that, and we are well on our way to 50,000 subscribers now. If you haven't subscribed to the channel already, I would love to get past that 50,000 subscriber point, and you would definitely help by doing that. There's obviously lots more videos that I'd really like to make on this lens and compare this lens to some of the other lenses in the field as well, and hopefully the content that I make for you is useful as well. And I do have some time coming up where I can start to make some of those guides around how to get the best out of your cameras, or those types of things as well. So I almost called it the 200 to 600 then. So the 180 to 600 is finally here. Hopefully you found this video useful. If you do have any questions, please do let me know in the comments. And as always, thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.